So, Katie, I have been hiding from the news, initially just the American news, and now just all news.
Great. What are you doing here?
True. There's no comeback from that. But I understand that you are going to tell us a little bit about all the things I've been avoiding.
Yeah, it's a bit of an elephant in the room this week, but I'm going to give my bad week to Europe's relationship with the United States of America. This isn't exactly one of those stories that we're choosing to talk about because it hasn't received enough media coverage, because frankly, the headlines of every media outlet around Europe are full of doom about our relationship with the US at the moment. But it does feel like something that would be good to just, take a step back from and try to figure out what it all means. So I'm going to do my best to do that this week.
Thank you, Katie.
You're very welcome. Frankly, if you have like cats been burying your head in the sand when it comes to everything to do with the US and news in general, who would blame you? So well done for being here.
I will say in my defense, I worked as a journalist in the States during his first presidency. So I'm just like, no.
The trauma is real. But I'll just give you a quick rundown of the latest things that have been happening in Trump land that specifically affect us over here in Europe, because there have been a few of them. As the former guest of this podcast and now president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, said when he was trying to sum up recent events, he said, "There are decades when nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen." And this was one of those weeks. So what happened? A couple of things. First, Trump announced new, wider tariffs on steel and aluminium that affect European companies pretty badly. It's not really clear what's going to happen with that yet, but there have been plenty of verbal threats flying across the Atlantic that suggest our trade relations are not exactly headed in a friendly direction. The second big thing is that Trump announced that the US was going to start talks with Russia about ending the war in Ukraine. Now, we are recording this on Tuesday, and those talks are just getting started as we speak over in Saudi Arabia. Ukraine is not invited to these talks, and neither are European leaders. What kind of message does that send? Well, it's very early days, but at the moment, all of the early signs are that any proposal coming out of these talks is going to be focused on what a deal on Russia's terms would look like, right? These talks are about trying to figure out what Putin could be given to make him agree to stop attacking Ukraine.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine peace talks where one of the crucial parties isn't involved getting very far.
Quite. And the Trump administration have made it very clear already that as far as they're concerned, it is okay if the price of peace includes, for example, Russia being permanently given some of the Ukrainian territory that it has taken during the war as a reward for kindly stopping its bombing of innocent people. They've also been very clear with the idea that they think it should be completely off the table for Ukraine to ever join NATO, if that's something that Putin wants, which of course, he does want that, because the idea of Ukraine joining NATO, that would really symbolize Ukraine being part of the West and very much out of his sphere of influence. So yeah, it is early days, but the shape of any hypothetical deal emerging from these talks seems instinctively like it will favor Russia. And certainly Ukrainians won't be in the room, and neither will negotiators from any other European countries to try and make things any different. So that was the second big blow in the middle of last week. The same day, Trump's defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, announces on a trip to Brussels that Europe is going to have to start paying for way more of its defense costs and stop free riding off the US to defend itself.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. It's something that comes up a lot in the States, right? Like this complaint that Europe is basically not paying for its own armies and the US has to pay for defending us. Like, is that really true? Is that valid?
Yeah, it's funny. It's one of those things that I think is pretty invisible to most Europeans who don't really engage with the military in any way on a daily basis. Obviously, every European country has its own national armed forces. But essentially, the US complaint is that European countries have been chronically underspending on their militaries for decades. And certainly it's true that historically, the US has spent way more on defense stuff, both people and equipment, For decades, it is the world's largest military spender. It pours about 3.4% of its GDP into this area, something like $967 billion last year,
Wow.
which is a huge amount of money in, actual dollar terms. But it's also very big as a percentage of the US economy. US governments have simply prioritized defense more, while European countries have been prioritizing, pouring money into our horrific socialist welfare systems and subsidizing contemporary dance or whatever other degenerate things we apparently do over here.
Ballet or bombs.
It's a choice. But anyway, the bulk of the running costs for NATO, the Western military alliance, those have always been covered by the US. And there are about 100,000 US troops stationed on this continent. So hypothetically, if Russia or someone else decided to attack continental Europe right now, a lot of the resources for defending us would come from the US. And Trump, during his first presidency, he got super mad about this. I kind of think that of everything that he's done, this is one of the less unreasonable things to get mad about. Europe is a big, rich continent. Why should we be dependent on the US to defend ourselves? It's a weird kind of situation. I mean, to our credit, lots of European countries have been spending more on defense since both the first Trump presidency and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. NATO countries are supposed to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. About 2/3 of them now do that. And some of them are spending way more than 2%. Poland, for example, is spending 4%. But that isn't enough for the Trump administration. And it is now signaling that strategically, it isn't even really that interested in defending Europe anymore. It's more interested in trying to work out how to handle its rivalry with China. Europe, we're big, we're rich, we should be left to our own devices, which I kind of think is fair enough, but it also creates a huge problem of how we would supposedly fill this big hole in our defense budget if the US just says to us that we're on our own now.
Yeah, that's something that's really moved. My understanding has really moved in the past few years because I was just so deeply raised with a value system that I think a lot of Europeans have been raised with of we will never do war again. Mm-hmm. And then when I was reporting in Ukraine, then you suddenly realize there's a huge difference between defense and attack. And that's a very privileged position to be in, to say weapons are all bad.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was the second or third thing. What else?
That was the third thing. I'm now on to the last thing, I promise. Probably the biggest shock came on Friday when the US Vice President J.D. Vance gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. It's this kind of annual defense gathering in Germany where Western leaders get together and talk about war, basically. And everyone had been expecting J.D. Vance to talk more about Ukraine and the future of the US defense relationship with Europe. But that is not what happened. What he did do is deliver this rather astonishing 19-minute ideological attack on Europe, basically shitting on our values, questioning whether Europe and the US have anything in common anymore, and telling us that as a continent, if we don't embrace Trump's ideology, we are not worth being friends with. He also accused Europe of fundamentally doing democracy wrong. He said our continent was overrun with censorship, and he accused European leaders of trying to overturn democratic elections. I mean, let's be clear, the bit about supposedly trying to overturn democratic elections was specifically a reference to Romania, where the first round of the presidential election got cancelled once it emerged that there'd been huge Russian interference. I too have questioned whether it was ultimately the right move to cancel this election after the fact. But I'm sorry, I mean, you MAGA people literally tried to claim that Trump won the 2020 election. And you're now going to come to our house and lecture us about not respecting democracy. I mean, the whole speech was quite stunning in its hypocrisy.
Oh, it's also just really frustrating because then any remotely shared opinion or feeling becomes dangerous. Even if you feel there's some truth in this, it's just it's still more important to hold your ground.
And it would be quite fair to question how much of the speech in general was really meant for us as Europeans. I mean, J.D. Vance is widely being talked about as having ambitions to run for president himself once Trump is done. And the whole speech did kind of feel like delicious red meat for the MAGA people following this back home, particularly the way that it picked and chose a few slightly random European court cases to paint this weird, distorted picture of Europe as this like hellish place that's been taken over by the woke virus or whatever. So maybe the speech was meant to be heard at least as much back home as on this side of the Atlantic. Having said that, there were a couple of things that were particularly shocking about J.D. Vance's little trip to Europe. One is that he met with the leader of the far-right AfD in Germany, Alice Weidel.
She seems very busy with all of these American people these days.
She's taking a lot of meetings, isn't she? Apparently, at the same time, Vance decided it wasn't worth his time to meet with the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And while I do see the practicality of this, it's very unlikely that Scholz is still going to be in power this time next week. The symbolism of the Vice President of the United States declining to meet with the Chancellor of Germany, a key ally, and instead meeting with the head of a party that is formally classified as an extremist organization, that is really quite astonishing, not least just a few days before the German elections. And it's a really clear indicator of who in Europe the Trump administration sees itself as being aligned with, seeing eye to eye with. And it is not mainstream governments, it is far-right parties.
Every time you say that, I'm like, oh no, the mainstream government in my country is a far-right one. Oh no.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's also part of the story, right? Like, not all of these parties are fringe anymore. They are becoming part of the establishment, which the Trump administration, I'm sure, is very happy to see on this side of the Atlantic. The other thing that was particularly disturbing about Vance's speech itself was the way that he talked about the threats facing Europe. He said, "The threat I worry about most vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's the threat from within." And that was when he proceeded to wang on for ages about how we're apparently doing democracy wrong over here. But even though all of that stuff was hypocritical and kind of jaw-dropping, that wasn't really the shocking thing about it. The shocking thing is that he was able to say that this apparent disagreement between the US and Europe when it comes to our values, that is more worrying to him than the threat posed by Russia. He couldn't have said it any clearer. And if you just let that sink in for a minute, how disturbing is that? I mean, Russia is a country that 3 years ago fully invaded its neighbor, totally unprovoked, with a view to taking over this country in its entirety. They have killed tens of thousands of people. And this country is apparently viewed by the new US government as less of a threat to Europe than our out of control woke values.
It's confusing because it's all really shocking. And on the other hand, he's just saying what we already knew he was going to say, right? Like, I mean, it just feels like we don't even live in the same universe anymore, let alone share the same values.
I mean, we don't. It's true. So to some extent, Vance was just saying out loud what everyone already knew. But the fact that he was saying this so openly, so publicly, this really feels like a public breakup. It feels like this moment where Europe has to stop thinking about the US as a friend in the world. And in practical terms, it means we really have to stop relying on the US to defend us if we get attacked.
God, I just wonder if there's going to be a moment in our lifetime where like the US just becomes a normal country because of all of this, rather than this huge superpower.
I mean, that might be nice.
Ever the silver lining. So what has the reaction been in Europe to all of this? Like, what has the response been, and to what extent is there one?
Yeah, so this is what's really interesting, I think. If you read the kind of European commentariat, there are two main thrusts to the takes that commentators have been coming out with off the back of this horrible, horrible week for US-Europe relations. And broadly, it is the pessimists versus the optimists. The pessimists are reacting to all of these developments by saying, Jesus Christ, we are screwed as a continent. You know, we Europeans can never agree about anything. The EU alone is made up of 27 governments that often pull in different directions. We're definitely not going to be able to launch any kind of coordinated response to losing the US as a strategic friend. Also, we are financially broke at the moment. So if we're going to be asked to spend billions more every year on defense because the US is leaving us alone to protect ourselves from Russia, we can't afford it. We're screwed. Oh, also, our biggest economies, Germany and France, have extremely messy politics right now. and it's not really clear who's in charge. So you can forget about EU leaders managing to get on the same page about this and actually doing anything about it. So that is one camp, the negative Norberts, we can call them. The other camp is the optimists. What can we call them? The positive Paulines?
Positive Patricia.
Patricias, sure. They are saying, Europe is forged in moments of crisis. Just look at COVID. We managed to launch some pretty decent joint initiatives when it came to getting everyone vaccinated, propping up the economy. We can do this, guys. Chief among these optimists, I would say, is the French president, Emmanuel Macron. To his credit, Macron is annoying in many, many ways, but he has been warning for years and years now about how Europe needs what he calls strategic autonomy from the US. This idea that we can't always rely on the US having friendly governments that share our values. We need to build up our own defense, our own strategic industries, and we need to stop relying on American money to prop up the militaries on this continent. And he has been right about that the whole time. But no one really wanted to admit it because, frankly, we don't want to spend money on defense. And I get it, I am a peace-loving person. I would much rather spend those extra percentage points of our GDP on education and reducing poverty and all of those other things. But I think this is really a moment where we have to be honest with ourselves as Europeans and say, okay, well, what is the threat of Russia attacking Europe beyond the horrors that it's already inflicted on Ukraine? And if the threat is as serious as we think it is, what are we going to do about it? So Macron, you know how he loves being the guy in Europe who gets everyone together. He hosted lots of European leaders for emergency talks in Paris on Monday. Not all EU leaders, which some of them were understandably pissed off about, but they met. And the clearest message coming out of these talks was, okay, yes, we agree. We need to increase our own defense spending. Nothing concrete. There was no specific number of billions coming out of these talks. But, this was one day of talks that was more about getting the conversation started than anything else. And it was interesting to hear Germany specifically talking about whether they might be able to change the debt rules to make it easier to spend money on defense. Because as we all know, Germany has historically been very into this idea of keeping a careful eye on spending and often lecturing other Europeans for supposedly not doing this. So if Germany does, as suggested, end up borrowing a bunch of money to spend more on defense, that would be a very big deal. What's also interesting is that you've seen over the last couple of days a few countries coming forward and saying we would be willing to send troops to Ukraine as peacekeepers if there was some kind of peace deal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's pretty big. And this would be to make sure that Russia doesn't go against the terms of any hypothetical peace deal and start invading more territory again. Notably, the UK has said that it would send troops. Sweden has said maybe. And France, behind the scenes, seems like it would do it. They've certainly talked about it previously. And this is really important because for all we know, Trump might meet with Putin and say, I've negotiated a fantastic peace deal, best deal ever. And that peace deal could be totally on Putin's terms. Because everything we've seen from Trump is that he doesn't really care about securing a solution for Ukraine that is just. He just wants to be able to go back to his base and say, you see, I told you I could fix Ukraine. And then he wants to get out of there because he does not care about Ukraine. He doesn't particularly care about restraining Russia in general from stomping across Europe. If anything, it's frightening to say it, but Trump sees a lot to admire in this authoritarian leader who, like him, has declared war on wokeism and wants to defend Christian values, masculine values.
Oh my God, when can we just have 100 years of women running the country or the world and just see what happens? I mean, come on.
Well, I really want to talk in a future episode about Iceland because politics there seems to be pretty much entirely female right now. I'm very intrigued to see what happens in the next couple of years. But let's save that for a future podcast.
I'm willing to admit it may not be perfect, but come on, it's not going very well.
It's not going great, guys. But anyway, Trump could say to Ukraine, there is a peace deal on the table, take it or leave it. And Ukraine might say, well, hang on a second, under the terms of this deal, we have had a bunch of our territory permanently taken away. We're also never allowed to join NATO, which would protect us from a future attack. There's also very good reason not to trust Putin if he says that he would be content with just having these little bits of extra territory, because he has said over and over and over again that he believes the whole of Ukraine should belong to Russia. And the US could say, well, to us, this deal looks pretty decent. So if you don't want it, Ukraine, we are not going to support you anymore at all. We are out. And if that happens, Europe needs to be there to be able to step in if we are serious about standing up for ourselves and standing up for our own security. Because this is the thing, Ukraine's security is our security. If we don't stop Putin from stomping on Ukraine, where does he stop? Does he go further? This isn't just about helping out a friend. It's actually in our own interest to help defend Ukraine. And, some of the more feisty commentators have been pointing out over the last week that economically, we do have the might to take on Russia without the US. The EU's economy is way bigger than Russia's. And even if you take out the US, NATO countries together have about twice the number of bodies in their armed forces as Russia does. So this is a question of willingness more than anything. And, it's funny, all of the attention at this Munich security conference was on J.D. Vance and his appalling speech. But there was also another speech that I think got way less attention than it deserved, which was the speech by the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And something he said that was really interesting is that this isn't really about spending more money on defense, or it's not just about that. What we really need is a change of mindset in Europe. We have felt safe for so long, especially, the further west you go on this continent, Europeans are just not in the habit of thinking about our safety, full stop.
Yeah, I think that's just so wild. Also because, I, until the past few years, never thought about safety. I live in the Netherlands. It's really the furthest west you can go almost. And it's just wild because both of my grandparents grew up in occupations and war, and I just don't understand how quickly that's gone.
Yeah.
But anyway, apparently it can also move quickly in the opposite direction.
This is not just about increasing defense spending as a GDP ratio. Money is needed, of course, yes, but money alone will not stop an enemy assault. People and weapons don't come for free. But again, it's not just about budgets. It's about people realizing the need to defend their own home.
Katy, as you say, we are 27 countries within the EU alone, and Europe is also bigger than that. Do the negative Norberts not have a point when they say that getting us to pull in the same direction is really quite hard?
Yeah, it is really hard. And within the EU alone, we have a bunch of national leaders who actively align with Trump, the Orbans and the Fizos and the Melonis. I mean, Meloni's a bit of a tricky one because she's far right, but also pro-Ukraine. So it'll be interesting to see how she positions herself on all of this. Zelensky said in his speech that it was time for Europe to have its own united army. It feels really clear that there are a lot of leaders in Europe right now who would answer that with, you've got to be kidding. I mean, look, there has been increasing talk in recent years of a need for a two-speed Europe, like a set of countries that want to integrate more and faster and act together on the world stage, and a set of countries who are less interested in that. I wonder if we might be headed less for a Europe of two speeds, but a Europe of two different value sets, like one set of countries that carries on defending what we think of today as European values, like, having properly independent courts, a free media that isn't just government propaganda, protecting minorities, that kind of thing. And then we might have another more Trumpy set of countries that are in the EU, maybe, and we can't really do anything about that. They're there already. But we just kind of leave them to do their own thing. I think we are going to have to be pragmatic about that. And this path forward for, better defending ourselves without US help, potentially helping Ukraine to seek the future that it wants, that is going to have to be a coalition of the willing that does that. And it won't include governments on the inside of the EU that have pro-Russian leanings, like Hungary's. And it might include countries that are on the outside of the EU but do share the same values, like the UK. Macron already started setting something like this up a couple of years ago. Remember that he set up this thing called the European Political Community? Maybe that's a place where this could start happening. I mean, look, I think we're just going to have to be flexible and also remember that nothing is permanent.
Flexible / utterly surrender to the many unknowns.
We'll do what we can. But I think we also need to remember that nothing is permanent. For all we know, there might be a reasonable government back in the White House in 4 years' time. There might also be an even more scary, unreasonable one, and we should plan for that. But it's a very weird time for this relationship that has been so important for Europe for such a long time. It really feels like things have gone topsy-turvy in the past week. Like, you've got European liberals who used to love America suddenly talking in terms of sovereignty and independence. And then you've got far-right Europeans who used to use that kind of language, now apparently seeming very comfortable with the idea of cozying up with this foreign power and being dependent on it. It's a very, very weird time.
Yeah, I also wonder if we need to start accepting that it's not so much these countries versus those countries, and that all of those opinions and value systems are inside each of our countries in varying degrees. I don't know if that would help anything, but that's something that comes up in me.
We absolutely have to recognize that if you look at the way that politics is going in so many countries. It's very true.